Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Rayner. I am the Dean of Research at the University of the Highlands and Islands, and in that capacity, I also look after the university's graduate school. And it's my really great pleasure on behalf of the university to welcome everybody here today to this very, very special occasion, the inaugural professorial lecture of Professor Roxane Andersen. I do have just a couple of quick notices to pass on to you before I hand over to our Principal and Vice Chancellor, who will introduce Roxane formally to you. Could I ask you all please to note that this event is being recorded, and the recording will be available later. I'll tell you something more about that towards the end of the event today. Also, could I ask you please to post any questions that you might have that you might like Roxane to try to answer, and she will answer, I'm sure, very well, in the Q&A section of the screen that you should have available to you, and I will pick up those questions and pose them on your behalf to Roxane.
Thank you very much for attending this inaugural lecture. It's a bit strange for me to be giving the inaugural lecture to my screen in my home office, but I hope that you will enjoy it, and I hope that I will enjoy it as well. So before starting the inaugural lecture, I just wanted to dedicate today's presentation to my dad. My dad unfortunately passed away with cancer this year, just a little bit before my title was confirmed. And I know that he would have been extremely proud because he had always been my biggest supporter. So just an acknowledgement of the immense support that I've received from my dad and the rest of my family throughout what has been so far a very difficult year. And you don't become a professor, I think, without an immense network of support and an immense network of collaborators. And before starting my presentation, I just wanted to acknowledge that all the research that I have been doing so far, and the research, some of this that I will be presenting today, has been done in collaboration with so many people. And I just want to acknowledge that, because this is not just my work, this is the collective work of the amazing Peatland scientific family that I'm very grateful to belong to. And of course, research needs funding, and I also just wanted to acknowledge that I've been extremely lucky over the years to have my research funded by a number of different agencies and funders, and I just want to acknowledge that research would not be possible without that support. Today, what I really wanted to cover with you is a little bit of my journey through the discovery of peatland. And the main thing I wanted to talk about, just to talk a little bit about peatlands, what they are, what defines their resilience, how they respond to disturbance and restoration in particular, and how our research is now starting to understand how we can measure the response of the peatlands to disturbance and restoration across scale and time. So just to start with, maybe just give you a little bit of background knowledge about northern peatlands, which are my habitat of choice, my habitat of preference. Northern peatland cover about 3% of the planet, and they're found in the areas of the planet where the climate and the landscape setting allows for plant to start to accumulate and decompose, not completely, and form peat. So they take lots of different forms. So there's peatlands that are dominated by vascular plants, and can cover huge areas. So, for example, I've been very lucky to go to many areas where there was stem or germinoid sedge-dominated peatlands, particularly in Alberta. There's also a number of other types of peatland, including bog, which are typically dominated by sphagnum mosses and can exist either as open landscapes or treed landscapes. So here are some examples of peatlands that I've also had the chance to visit in Siberia on the left and in Canada on the right. Often peatlands occur in mosaic of these different types of peatlands interconnected together, covering large expanse of landscapes. And in some particular parts of the planet, at high latitudes where we find oceanic, hyperoceanic climates, where the climate is cool year-round with excess precipitation or very high moisture, there's one particular type of peatland that can form. It basically forms over the landscape, blanketing the landscape, and incidentally is called the blanket bog. So only 3% of all the peatlands in the planet are blanket bogs. This is a globally really rare type of peatland. But it also happens to be the type of peatland that is the most prevalent in the UK, and in particular in Scotland, where it covers nearly a quarter of the land area. And blanket bog, like some of the other peatlands, are typically dominated by a mixture of different types of plant, including sphagnum, sedges, and shrubs. And here's an example of a blanket bog up here in the north of Scotland. All of these peatlands share one thing in common, and it's that the plants that cover the peatlands do whatever plants do. They take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis and incorporate it into their biomass. However, in peatland, the conditions don't allow the decomposition process to take place at very, very fast, and because of that, there's an imbalance. The uptake by plant exceeds the losses that can come through degradation, aerobic respiration, so as form of CO2, anaerobic decomposition in the form of methane, or aquatic losses, so carbon that leaves the system into the waterways. As a result, the peatlands accumulate organic matter and carbon over time. This process in peatlands happens very slowly. The northern peatland average is about 1 millimeter per year, so the peat accumulates very, very slowly and forms deposits over a very long period of time. In northern Scotland, where the climate is particularly cool, and this rate is even a little bit slower, and this is something that some of our research has been finding in the last few years. So peatland store carbon, and they store it for a very, very long time, but very slowly. But what that means is that as long as you don't disturb these conditions that exist in peatland, as long as the peatland can continue to take up the carbon, it just stays in the system. And I really like this graphic that is being produced by a group in Canada, and it just shows that most of the carbon in peatland, most of the biomass is in the peat underneath the soil. And there may be more carbon in peatland than there is in a tropical rainforest, which seems quite counterintuitive when you look at a rainforest and you see all the trees on the top. However, and that's really the important thing as well, is that the carbon is there's not just more carbon, it stays in the system for far longer. Whereas typically carbon in forest system would stay for hundreds of years. If the peatlands remain undisturbed, the carbon there can stay for thousands and thousands of years. In Scotland, the peatlands have started to form after the retreat of the glacier, and has been continuing to grow ever since, so thousands and thousands of years. And if left alone, and if the landscape processes allow it, this peat can eventually become cold, which means that the carbon is stored for even longer periods of time. So what that means is that despite the fact that peatland only cover 3% of the land area, they store nearly a third of the soil carbon. There is more carbon in the peatland than there is in the rest of the Earth's biomass combined, more than twice the forest of the Earth. And therefore that makes peatland absolutely extraordinary in their capacity to store carbon. They're the most efficient terrestrial carbon sink that we have on the planet. And my favorite plant is sphagnum. And sphagnum is the species that makes bog, the species that is so important for some of these northern peatlands. And this species is very small. It's a very, very small moss. But we know now that there is more biomass bound up in sphagnum moss, living or dead, so either living or in the form of peat or in the form of coal, than in any other single genus of plant on Earth. I mean, how cool is that? There is no cooler plant than sphagnum on the whole planet, in my opinion. Sphagnum are amazing. They're what we call ecosystem engineers. basically their biochemistry, their ecology, their morphology means that not only do they thrive in conditions that we find in northern latitude, they actually create those conditions. And they sustain these conditions over time by creating acidic condition, maintaining high water table, keeping these systems with low input from groundwater, so very low in nutrients. And in doing that over thousands of years, and since they started to evolve 20 million years ago, what it means is that sphagnum have actually had a really big effect on the global biogeochemistry. They have helped cool the climate over those long periods of time and have helped maintain these cool conditions in which they thrive. These conditions in turn are very specific and require unique adaptation from all the other organisms that can live in peatland. Things like carnivorous plant, for example, can be found there, but also a whole range of unique, adapted, very specialist species across a whole range of taxa, from invertebrates to microbes to vertebrates to plants. And that means that although there's not a lot of species in peatland, the species that are found there are absolutely unique and really, really important in terms of contribution to global biodiversity. And as I said, through their capacity to engineer their own environment, and through these very complex feedback loops that involve their structure, their ecology, and their physiology, sphagnum help maintain this high water table. And that's really the key into inhibiting the decomposition that allows the peat to accumulate. So they maintain these anaerobic conditions, the conditions in which microbes are not really able to decompose the organic matter. So peat continues to build up, and as it does so, the cycle continues. And what is also quite amazing is that not only is the sphagnum influencing the hydrology of the peatland, it also influenced the mechanics. The properties of the peat, the properties of the porosity, the elasticity, and the mechanical properties of the peat mean that it actually has, as a landscape, can respond to change in volumes of water and gas by expanding when there's a lot of water or gas, or shrinking when there's a dewatering or degassing event. This phenomenon is known as bog breathing. Peatlands breathe. How amazing is that? Peatland breathe, and that is a really important key feedback mechanism that has enabled and maintained resilience of peatlands for a very long time. We've known that for quite a long time. We've known that for many decades. However, whilst it's been possible to measure ecology and it's been possible to measure hydrology in peatlands, it's been very difficult to measure that mechanical response, the bog breathing response underground. Imagine trying to measure the response of a surface by walking on that surface. It's very, very difficult indeed. And one of the most interesting piece of research I've been involved with in the last few years has been trying to find a solution. How can we measure bog breathing, which we know is going to be a really important measure of resilience, without going on to the bog? And of course, one of the possible solutions is to turn to space and use satellite. And that's exactly what happened when in 2016, a group of researchers led by David Large at the University of Nottingham, myself and Andrew Souther from Terra Motion decided to try and see whether satellite radar could provide a solution. With the Sentinel satellites that go around the Earth every 6 days, one of the satellites uses radar, and the radar basically bounces off the surface and goes back to the satellite. And every time it does that, it provides a distance, a measure of surface elevation. And by comparing multiple measures over time, you can build up a time series of how the surface is moving. And these time series of motions are effectively a measure of the bog breathing. And what we've been doing over the last few years has been trying to understand, is that measure valid? Is that representative of what we understand of peatland ecology and hydrology? So we've looked at those time series, we've looked at the long-term trend, we've deconstructed those time series to look at seasonal oscillation patterns and different properties, and validated it against field observation to start to develop some of the applications. And what we found really was that those satellite-derived surface motion are indeed true reflection of what happens on a peatland in terms of its hydrology and ecology at a range of scales, and therefore it becomes an ideal tool to study the resilience over large areas. For example, here on the graphic, you can see that the line in blue is showing a long-term trend of uplift, which is representative of a mass gain otherwise, or if you want, the peatland is growing. The orange curve is showing a net trend of subsidence. It means the mass is lost, is shrinking, and that's usually associated with degradation of peatland, erosion, for example, or shrinking through drainage. In other words, this is an ideal tool to explore peatland resilience. And for the very first time, what we've been able to do is apply that large-scale monitoring of the surface motion to understand how peatland landscapes respond to disturbances. In 2018, there was a severe drought across the whole of Europe. And during that drought, we were monitoring we were looking at some of the data. And what we found was that during a drought period, as we expect, the pores in sphagnum peat collapse. As the peat dry, the pores collapse, and that leads to a rapid subsidence of the surface that you can see here on the graph as the black arrow is pointing through that period of drought. The surface goes down very quickly. As it goes down, the peat compresses a little bit, and that maintains a very high moisture level. Basically, after the drought, the peat was wetter than it was at the start of the drought because of that mechanical collapse. And when we can, so that's a really important kind of mechanism for resilience. And what we found was that that mechanism was in particular very important for the next disturbance that happened to our peatlands. When in 2019, following that year of drought, we had a very big wildfire up here. And we used the INSAR data to look at how the response during the drought had influenced the resilience to fire, so the severity of burning. And what we find is that all of those areas that had high cover of sphagnum, that had this really kind of good condition peat, collapsed really rapidly. So these areas are indicated by the darker colors on the image on the left. And these in turn corresponded to areas that were not so impacted by the wildfire, where we only found unburned or low severity burning. The response of degraded areas was different, where there was no collapse and instead a higher severity of burn. If we summarize that, what we found was that the negative feedback loops that link the mechanics, the hydrology, and the ecology are really important to increase resilience in your natural peatland. And through degradation, if we switch these negative to positive feedback loops, it means that losing that mechanical response can make them more vulnerable to additional disturbances. And that really takes me to the next part of the talk, where I want to tell you what the problem is with draining peatlands. Peatlands have long been underappreciated and converted to different land uses to increase productivity, food production, timber production, and other changes in land use. The problem with that is obviously that drainage, so changing the hydrology, impacts the mechanical properties, impacts the ecology, and impacts all of those feedback. It makes the peatland not function anymore as a peatland. In fact, so far globally, the peatlands that we think of as amazing carbon stores have actually become net carbon sources of the atmosphere. And that's because even if only a small proportion of the peatlands have been degraded globally, this has completely switched the system around, and the carbon that is lost from degraded peatland is lost far quicker than the carbon that is taken in by healthy peatland. As well as the carbon impacts, there have been losses of biodiversity, so the losses of all of these unique species associated with peatlands. So drainage of peatland, even small areas of peatland globally, have had profound impacts on the Earth system in terms of the release of carbon and loss of biodiversity. Of course, this is very common to people here in Scotland, where we know that about 80% of our peatlands have been degraded to some degree. And in the UK, it is now estimated that peatlands, degraded peatlands, contribute emissions of approximately 23 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. If you don't know what that means, it means that if we decide to include our peatlands in the IPCC reporting, it actually switches the whole land use sector from a net sink to a net source of carbon. And if we think about our targets of reaching net zero, well, having drained peatland is really not going to be a good thing for us. We need to tackle that problem if we want to meet these targets. But it's not just about meeting our targets. these emissions, and because of the breakdown of these feedback mechanisms, are likely to increase even further with additional pressure from climate change, and in particular become very sensitive to catastrophic losses that could happen through drought and in particular wildfire. And if we want to put that in perspective, recently we prepared for a presentation where we tried to put that into the global picture. So you can see in the graph here, the kind of purple color represents the potential peatland carbon stock that could be at risk. So that's what exists in the peatlands today, that we don't really know what the fate of this system is going to be because it depends what we're going to do to our peatlands. The orange represent the current emissions from degraded peatlands, so not that much, but not negligible either. And the blue color represent our remaining budget to 1.5 degrees. And what is apparent and really critical here is that we only need to lose a tiny bit of what is left in our peatland to blow up our chances of maintaining the global Earth temperature below 1.5 degrees. These habitats are absolutely critical in the survival of our species. And of course, some people have understood that, and over the last 25 years, the understanding of the importance of peatland for biodiversity and greenhouse gas emission has led to the large-scale restoration. Initially started small scale, but is now happening at a faster pace than ever and at unprecedented scales. And you can see it here with the digger in the picture and the area covering thousands of hectares of restoration. However, it is important to make sure that if we deploy these resources, if we invest money and if we invest time and if we invest equipment into restoration, we need to do that in the most cost-efficient way because there are limited resources, and therefore we need a really sound understanding of peatland that needs to be underpinned by really robust evidence base. And this was really what I was asked to do when I started to work for the ERI in the north of Scotland. I was asked to develop peatland research in Scotland, and in particular to build the evidence base for forest to bog restoration in the flow country of northern Scotland. The flow country is the largest expanse of blanket bog in the world, a globally rare type of peatland, and it covers pretty much the whole of the north of Scotland. And you can see why being at ERI gives me a home advantage in terms of studying the flow country peatland. It is also a candidate for UNESCO World Heritage Site because of its quality in terms of habitat and biodiversity. However, much like the rest of Scottish peatland and UK peatland, it's not been spared by human influence, and about 17% of the flow country peatlands have been afforested with non-native conifers during the 1960s to the 1980s. And that was largely a consequence of a poorly designed tax incentive. It was well-meaning. It was to stimulate the economy and make the UK independent in terms of its timber production after the Second World War, but it had absolutely devastating impacts on breeding waders and conservation of these important habitats. Because of that impact on biodiversity and the recognition of that impact since the late 1990s, there has been efforts to turn back these landscapes into open blanket bog rather than a forested landscape. But there was a number of different questions that we needed to answer to help understand the impact of forestry, but also how to go about with the restoration. One of these questions was, well, do we know, was putting trees on peatland really a bad idea in terms of carbon, or are the trees actually compensating for whatever carbon might be lost from the peatland? If we do this forest to bog restoration, does it work? Can we bring back the biodiversity, below ground processes and everything that leads back to carbon sequestration? And if we do that, can we actually get carbon benefit and climate benefit from doing that forest to bog restoration? And that was really my mandate when I started. So I thought, I can't answer all of these questions by myself. Let's set up a collaborative, coordinated network of researchers and stakeholders, because that's what I learned in my formative years in Canada. And then get some funding together and start getting data. And over the last kind of 9 years, that's allowed us to set up well over 40 collaborative projects under the umbrella of the Flow Country Research Hub. And these projects have tackled everything from bog breathing, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emission, water quality, carbon stock hydrology, brought them all together to help us understand what has happened. So did afforestation cause carbon losses? Well, of course, we know some of the processes that lead to carbon losses. We know that it depends if trees take up carbon, it depends how much carbon goes out and how much carbon goes in. However, there was nobody at the time when the trees were planted to measure those fluxes of carbon, and nobody to do it for the whole time of the plantation. So it's very difficult to know how much carbon is being lost for the whole time using that kind of approach. We need a different kind of approach. We need to compare stocks of carbon. It's difficult to do carbon stocks comparison if you don't have something, a similar date to compare with. So you need to compare things that are similar, that have accumulated over the same period of time. And to do that, we decided that we'd use something that is quite particular of peatland, and it's their capacity to store things over time. And that thing in particular was the ash clouds that come out of volcanic eruption in Iceland. So when a volcano erupts in Iceland and gives an ash cloud, some of that ash will deposit over peat, and as peat continues to form, it will slowly but surely accumulate layers of ash, very thin layers of ash in the peat. If we can identify these layers of ash in the tephra, which are the microscopic volcanic ash shards that are preserved in the peat, they become extremely useful chronological markers, because unlike carbon dating that can be a little bit uncertain, or that's got some uncertainty, when you have the shard, you know for sure what eruption it came from, and then you have a very precise dating that you can use for comparison. Therefore, what we did is develop novel methods to detect and identify those shards in the peat. So we used an eye track, so X-rays to basically X-ray lots and lots of peat cores to find those layers and identify layers that were common throughout a lot of different areas in the peatlands. We found that one particular layer, Ecla4, was present in a lot of the different peatlands in the flow country, and we could use that. What we then did is collected peat cores in forestry area and in areas that were adjacent to them, but due to political boundaries had not been afforested, and compared the stocks of carbons above Hecla 4 between those two areas. We also then harvested the trees and the root mass to see how much carbon had been stored in the trees in the meantime. And did afforestation cause carbon losses? Probably, and probably a lot. So that's what we found. We found that on average, there have been losses of 103 tons of carbon per hectare in the peat itself. Some of that had been compensated by the tree growth, but not all of it. And in most of the cases, there was some losses as well. However, there was also a very big range of variation, and it showed that it really depended on the forestry practice, the location of the forestry in the landscape, and the peatland itself. And there's still a bit more that we need to understand. However, it seems like the answer is yes, afforestation caused carbon losses, and probably and potentially quite a lot of carbon losses. The second thing we wanted to know was, how does forestry and forest to bog impact biodiversity and biogeochemical processes? Like I said before, bogs have very specialist communities of plants and invertebrates and microbes and higher vertebrates and animals, and all of these lead to efficient carbon nutrient and cycling through all of the feedback mechanism I was talking about earlier. So what we did is we compared what we found in the bog with what we found in the forest, and what we found was effectively that because the trees grow, the canopy closes, and introduce shades, change the nutrient, there might have been some fertilization as well at the time of the forestry, and all of these things mean that the bog specialists disappear very rapidly and are replaced by generalist communities or forest specialists. And these in turn don't have the same capacity to maintain the efficient carbon and nutrient cycling and lead to increased carbon losses and increased nutrient losses. But can we bring those back with restoration? Well, not really, at least not with very simple restoration that were used at the time when we started to do these pieces of research. At the time, the restoration was mostly felling to waste, which means the trees were just cut down and left on site. So there was a lot of brash material, a lot of branches, lots of timber that was left on site. And what we found was that when all of that brash was still present, it really prevented the species to come back. And in particular, some of the moss, the Sphagnum moss species, were not able to come back. And when we looked at the invertebrate communities, we found very similar things. So this is a graph that presents 3 of the species that are bog specialists. And what we can see is that these species are not very common, not very frequently found in forest, F in the graph, or throughout the restoration chronosequence that we looked at. So from year 2 to 18, these species don't really change, they don't really come back. And that's very different in the bog, where these species are all much more frequent. This is because these particular species of carabid beetle are not very good at going far out of the bog. So they don't disperse very easily. And the distance that they would need to cover to go from the bog to the restored area is a bit too big. And if they did manage to get there, then they would be outcompeted by some of the generalist species that are there. And then when we looked at microbes, we found more or less the same story. So some of the microbes here that we looked at are called testate amoebae, and testate amoebae are effectively the tigers of the microbial community. They are the top of the microbial food chain. They eat bacteria and fungi. And if they're in good order, then you have a good idea that the microbial loop is functioning quite well. And what we found again is that those specialist species that are typically associated with sphagnum are not coming back. What was really interesting was that, in particular, a lot of the species that are associated with sphagnum are what we call mixotrophs. They can do photosynthesis like a plant, as well as eat fungi and bacteria like the other testate amoebae. They're particularly sensitive to shade and to water level. And because these are not returning readily with the initial forest to bog restoration felling to waste that was happening, these are not coming back. And that really, it really means that it's not just the species that are not coming back, it's also the function that they carry, in this case, the contribution of photosynthesis. So we know that when the forest to bog felling to waste restoration was taking place, it rapidly brings the water table up, but it doesn't bring it up all the time. And what we see in this graph is there's these little outliers. So you can see in the forestry, the water table is quite far below the surface, somewhere between 40 and 50 centimeters below the surface, but it dips much lower than that in periods of drought. After the restoration, it rapidly rises, but it continues to dip into these much lower water table depths, even 18, 17 years after the restoration has been done. And that's the key. The sphagnum really needs that stable high water table, and these occasional dips mean that it changes some of the processes. And again, having left the brash on the site meant that there was more nutrient kicking about, and these nutrients were entering the system. And what we could see is that when the brash started to be broken down by some of the microbes, then there was a pulse of nitrogen into the system. And that pulse of nitrogen in turn stimulates more decomposition, particularly in those periods where the water table drops down a bit lower and increases oxygen. So we have a bit more nutrient, a bit more oxygen. That means a bit more decomposition. In turn, that makes a more rapid turnover of the vegetation. So the litter gets turned over a bit more quickly. And that means that it feeds back on the vegetation as well. So some more nutrients are absorbed by the vegetation, it's more easily decomposable, and so on, and so on, and so on. But we still wanted to know, even if the species are not quite there yet, even if those processes are not quite there yet, is forest to bog restoration returning that capacity to sequester carbon and deliver the climate benefits that we hope it can? And as we've just seen, the woody debris and the water do contribute to changes in water chemistry and do contribute to emissions of carbon dioxide, in particular in those periods of dry weather. And what we found when we compared the kind of net ecosystem exchange, that is the proportion of carbon going in versus going out. So positive numbers mean there's carbon going out. So what we found is that 10 years and 12 years after restoration, there's still more carbon dioxide coming out than going in. So the peatlands are not yet functioning as a carbon sink. However, when we looked at slightly older sites, so 16, 18 years old, these sites turned out to be net carbon sinks. So even if some of the processes are not quite there yet, there is enough photosynthesis to stimulate that carbon uptake and to retain the carbon in the system in terms of CO2. And what was extraordinary, in fact, was that the sites even outdid, it was better in terms of carbon sequestration than the reference near natural bog that's never been afforested that we use as a comparison for that. So bringing that all together, what we understood was that when we had forest to bog restoration taking place in these areas, we could see two different types of effect. The first one was a restoration effect. So the fact that we took the trees down changed the system. It was rapid change in water chemistry, increase of emission related to that disturbance, and a replacement of some of the forest specialists that need the trees by generalist species that are a bit more able to cope with a range of conditions. Over time, what we see is that the system is not going back to a completely functional blanket bog, and that's because we have legacy effects, so effects that take much longer to overcome, or thresholds that we've not been able to get over yet. That means there's still changes in water chemistry, there's carbon sequestration, but still not quite the right biogeochemical processes, and that means that in periods of drought, for example, these systems are more likely to emit carbon. And of course, the persistence of these general species and the lack of the recovery of some of those key specialist species. And while the research was happening on the fang to waste sites, as is typical, the practice was changing. So the timber was getting bigger, the trees were getting bigger, and the information that we were getting from our research also kind of supported the idea that we should really get rid of the brash and we should try to re-wet these systems a little bit better. So we needed bigger intervention. And what happened was that some of these older sites where forest to bog restoration with felling to waste had happened were revisited for further enhanced management, and new sites that were targeted by restoration were just targeted by completely new and different techniques. And what we are now trying to understand with the research is, are these new methods that are maybe more stronger in terms of intervention, maybe more expensive, do they actually bring restoration effect faster? So can we overcome these thresholds and these barriers faster? And can we actually get over the hump and get those systems back into functioning? And what we find so far is that it seems that yes, we can. It seems that there are faster changes. The recoveries are a bit faster. And there may be a bit more space for some of those specialist species, but there might still be more that we need to do. And this is really the kind of next steps that we're trying to understand. But one of the challenges that we have is that it's fine to do these fine scale studies and measure these fine scale things, but restoration has been ramping up massively, and we're now talking about thousands and thousands of hectares being restored every year. So how do you do to measure condition and restoration outcome at such large scales? We can't just send everybody out to try to measure, invertebrate diversity or collect size samples everywhere or put up flux towers everywhere. They are very expensive and difficult to run. We need to find another way to look at peatland that could allow us to understand whether they are functioning or not after restoration intervention. And of course, we decided to try to go back to bog breathing, because we know now that bog breathing can be measured from space. We know that it's a reliable measure of eco-hydrological functioning. And so in recent years, what we've been trying to do is trying to understand, could we use bog breathing, not just as a measure of resilience and understanding impacts of change, but also as a way to measure and monitor condition. So one of the things that we did is that we used the flow country as a test bed for this idea, and we selected 255 polygons. Each polygon was, a small area of peatland. They were chosen in sites that we knew very well and randomly across the whole of the flow country. And then we combined our understanding of these time series of surface motion with a very detailed eco-hydrological profiling by visiting most of these sites and looking at the vegetation, looking at the hydrology, looking at the land management history. And we tried to come up with an understanding of the bog breeding signature at the landscape scale that would be meaningful for monitoring. And what we found was that the different properties of the bog breeding were indeed really interesting to look at, and we were able to relate them very effectively to different things like management type and types of vegetation and eco-hydrological functioning. So what we found here, looking at this multi-annual velocity, so the long-term trend, is the peatland growing or is the peatland shrinking, is that in most of the areas that were under conservation management, that were typically dominated with healthy bogs with lots of sphagnum and sedges and shrub, these sites were showing signs of uplift and were actually the only signs where we could see uplift. the subsidence, the bigger subsidence rates were found in the restoration of the forest to bog areas. Apologies. And that was where the management interventions are much more intense and produce that compaction with the machinery on top of the peatland. The other properties of surface motion, so not just the long-term velocity, but also the amplitude and the timing, put together against the eco-hydrological attribute, enables us to produce a classification that can then be used to monitor condition or restoration progress over time. And that is amazing. It's like having a new lens to look at peatlands and a new way to understand how peatlands can change over time. And by doing that, we're able to match those with what we expect in terms of restoration outcome, but also what we expect in terms of management. So for example, here we have a series of classes that are typically recognizable features on the ground in terms of restoration. So for example, degraded peatland, this is where you start. Early rewetting would be what we expect after the intervention. Late rewetting would be what we expect if a site would be on track to become a bit more like a function a bit more like a peatland. And then we have potential targets or endpoints to the restoration, whether they are pools or sphagnum-rich areas, or for example, margins of the peatlands. And then of course we can map that progress against the target. So here's an example where we looked at a site that had been restored over a number of years, used the INSAR to produce a map of where we thought we were against those targets based on the time series of INSAR surface motion. And that can be done for a site, but it could also be done for the whole of Scotland, for the whole of the peatland in Scotland. And we could therefore, over time, be able to get a far better understanding of where peatlands conditions are, how are they changing, and how things are progressing. And that really brings me to the kind of the conclusion and outlook of my lecture, and the things I hope you will remember, and the things that mean the most to me. So to me, peatlands are a resilient system, but also incredibly amazing in their natural state. And I think that the degradation of peatlands already has had and could continue to have catastrophic consequences for the Earth system, and therefore we need peatland restoration and conservation and protection. That needs to be underpinned by scientific evidence to support our fight against the global biodiversity and climate crisis. And I think that we are now at the point where we have new tools and technologies that can support much more effective global strategies for managing those habitats. And where do we go from now? Well, I hope to continue, and I'm lucky to have funding to continue my research looking into sphagnum and how it responds to change, and in particular to the dual pressures of climate change and land use change, and how that translates to landscape resilience. And I'm also really hopeful that we can secure the World Heritage Site for the Flow Country peatland, because there is no peatland currently recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Site, and to me that makes no sense at all. These are some of our most important systems in terms of global carbon sequestration, and that surely is something that we want to leave for the next generation of hopefully budding peatland scientists. And with that, I just really want to thank and acknowledge again the huge support I've received over the years from so many people. And thank you again for logging in today and listening to my lecture. So stop sharing now my screen.
Thank you really very much indeed for that, Roxane. I've been utterly spellbound by what you've had to present to us. It's an amazing story. I mean, one can feel across the airwaves the enthusiasm that you bring to this and the passion that you bring to it. And I think what more could anybody ask for from an inaugural lecture? Truly wonderful. Really do appreciate that. I've noticed we have got one question that's come up in the chat, and I'll pass that on to you in just a sec. If other colleagues have got visitors to us have got questions, please put them in the Q&A session. We'll get through as many as we can. But the first question actually segues very nicely from what you've just said, and that was, what advantages would designating the Flow Country as a World Heritage Site actually bring?
I think there's a number of things here, really. In terms of advantages, I think it's really this stamp of approval, this global recognition. And what I think is that having the Flow Country as a World Heritage Site might just spur other countries that have very large peatland to think about their peatland in the same way. The protection, it doesn't give automatically give an extra layer of protection, but it does so through local planning, and it does so through the other layers of protection that already exist. But I think it also gives that much bigger recognition. And really, my hope would be that if we can do that for the Flow Country, why not try to do that and maybe establish a network of global peatland becoming World Heritage Site, recognizing their importance for not just biodiversity, but also climate, the global climate.
Thanks very much indeed for that. There's a few questions coming in now. One actually is just a request that we, if it's possible at some stage, we don't know quite how to do this, but to share the list of academic references that you've used in the presentation. You've clearly sparked a considerable interest in somebody there that will maybe look at a way to do that. But there is a question here. And this is moving on the screen. Trying to ask you to forgive me for that. So is there a peat depth below which bog breathing doesn't typically occur, and so couldn't be used as a means of measuring bog function?
This is really interesting. What we find is that there are actually typical signatures of bog breeding that seem to be associated with thinner peat. So they're not going to be the same type of signature, but they may be the lack of certain motion that we could relate to the fact that they're a thinner peat. But the relationship between the bog breeding and the peat depth is one that we're really trying to understand a bit better and are actively working on at the moment. Obviously, deeper peat will have different behaviors than very thin peat, and this is something that we're hoping to disentangle a little bit better.
Again, thanks very much indeed for that. Another question here, a note of thanks for a brilliant and informative study with an exclamation mark. That will go for many people, I think. Question is, have you thoughts on strategies for the restoration of working peat bogs where peat has been extracted? Really, what's the best strategic approach that can be taken? You've covered that a little bit in what you presented.
Yeah, I mean, this is really where my career in peatland started. So I did my PhD back in Canada, and I was working with extracted sites. And there have been lots and lots of methods developed for the restoration of areas of peat that have been extracted. And a lot of it depends on how far down they've been extracted. So Ireland has also been quite good in terms of the developing some of the restoration for their kind of cutover and cutaway peats. And what is really the key in that case is that the bare peat substrates are not very hospitable for vegetation. So plant reintroduction often is needed. And then the choice of the plant that will go back depends on the condition of the peat, the pH, depends on the nutrient, and that will decide really what plants you should be putting back. And then it's all about water table management, so the hydrology, bringing back that water table close to the surface to allow these species to thrive. But there is an incredible amount of literature and knowledge in Canada in particular, and in the States as well, and in Ireland, as well as a little bit in Estonia and the Baltic countries, where some of the restoration have started to take place as well.
Thanks very much. Another question. Do you have any recommendations for how management of common grazings that conserve peatlands but also provide economic benefit to crofters? How might that work in the grand scheme of thing of protection and conservation of the peatlands?
Yeah, I suppose, there's been quite a few people that have undertaken restoration and have not seen detrimental effects in terms of grazing. So I think the two are not completely incompatible. But there might also be other ways. So there's a lot more discussion now about, potential carbon finance or potential ways of marketing the good management of peatland. So for example, maybe keeping a peatland in good condition could be a way of generating income. So there are these discussions happening at the moment where it might be possible to get financial rewards for good management and good protection of peatland that that may help support some of these communities. But I don't think that they are incompatible, and I think that peatland restoration, drain blocking is perfectly compatible with with the continued use of peatland, or at least an area of grazing. I think it's just finding that right balance between the two.
Thanks very much again. Let me come on. There's a number of questions coming in now, which is really good to see. One is, how can we succeed in scaling from micro to Earth system scale key C cycling processes? It remains quite a challenge. Now, I don't know how you'd respond to that. That sounds quite a technical question, but what's your view?
I think that one of the difficulty is really that we need to make sure that we have a good understanding of the processes, and then these processes need to be integrated to some degree to the kind of modeling that can happen at regional or global scales. And the cheeky answer to that question is, if we get the funding for the grant that we've just applied for, we'll be able to tell you the answer to that question in about 5 years.
That sounds very good. That's one that should be recorded and sent to the funders straight away to perpetuate and encourage funding. We have time probably for a couple more. That's all. But we will try to get answers to some of the questions that come in after this event. Roxane has kindly agreed to do that for us, so we'll answer a couple more just now. This one is, do you think climate change will ultimately impact peatland function in other parts of the UK? And if so, over what likely timescales? Might this, for example, affect the viability of restoration work on shallower bank peats further south and east in the UK?
I think there's two ways to answer that question. So one of the ways to answer that question is by saying that actually climate change is already impacting our peatland. We've already seen impacts of climate change in terms of the higher frequency of fire, higher frequency of drought. So, and I guess the way to think about it is, well, if the peatlands are restored and more resilient, they're less likely to be impacted by future climate change. But another way to think about it is that, yes, it may be true that in the future, in maybe 50, 100 years' time, some of the areas that are currently covered in peatlands may be outside of their climatic space, or may not be in the best possible space for peatland to continue to function. It doesn't mean that those peatlands will disappear overnight. It doesn't mean that they will stop to function. But it might be that investing restoration efforts might be, might have to be targeted to make sure that we restore the peatlands that are more likely to be still functional in the long term in terms of their climatic space. It is very difficult to predict where the climate space may be shrinking, because the models are, inherently very difficult to. We don't know where the climate range really start because of this legacy of disturbance that we have in the UK. So we can't start with the current distribution. It's a very difficult question. But I really think that there's this, balance. It's already happening. We know that restoration can help, can bring some of the resilience back. And because we need to target our efforts, maybe it's good to target our efforts where they are more likely to make a bigger difference in the long term.
Again, thank you very much for that. Probably one more question, if I may. Of all the things that you've discovered in your research journey and the career as you've presented it today, what would you say has been the most exciting single thing that you've discovered, and what perhaps was the most surprising?
That's a very good question. I'm extremely excitable. I get excited about just about everything I find about peatland, but I must say that the research that we've been doing on bog breathing has been truly remarkable in terms of the way that we've been able to rethink peatlands in the last few years. So for me, that's really been one of the highlights. But I get excited about just about everything. We was reading a paper recently about communication between mosses through volatile organic compounds, and that's extremely exciting to me, the idea that mosses can be talking to each other. And I get just excited about everything. I think surprising, I'd say I'm not sure there's anything that is not equally surprising or exciting, but definitely I think there's so much fascination, and that's probably why I do this job, is that I am curious, I am passionate about peatland, in case you've not noticed yet, and I do get truly excited about every little thing that I find almost on a daily basis.
I'm really sorry, colleagues, that I'm going to have to call a halt to the questions now. As I say, there will be, if there are others in there that haven't been answered, we will try to answer them afterwards. But there's a wee formal bit of this whole process that I'm about to do just now, with your indulgence. And I have to say, it is with truly great pleasure that I've got the opportunity, on behalf of the University of the Highlands and Islands, to welcome you, Roxane, formally into the university's professoriate. But before I do that, there's a few things I'd like to say, just to put all of what we've been doing today into a little bit of context for everybody that's here. And first, if I could ask everybody here just to try to bring to your mind, if you can, a picture of what you think a professor is. I wonder what image that might conjure up in your mind. Now, I dare say for some of you, it might be a caricature of somebody perhaps wearing glasses, being slightly awkward, eccentric, perhaps a university boffin, you know, a bit removed from reality and everyday life. The sort of caricatures that sometimes are presented in the pictures you get in the various clip arts that you can get. Now, precisely whether that's an accurate description or not, what I think we can all agree on is that when you use the title professor, it indicates somebody who's at the very top of their academic game and a master of their chosen field. And that's what we've heard and seen today. As such, in being honoured with the title professor, we've witnessed someone today in the person of Roxane, who's been recognised for the highest rank that can be achieved in academia, and who thoroughly deserves that accolade. But what actually does a professor do? Now, you can answer that question in many ways, because they do many things. They undertake advanced research and they publish. They lead the exploration of new areas. They supervise postgraduate students. They lead, motivate, and inspire others. Roxane Andersen does all of these things by the bucket load and does them exceptionally well. But she, as other professors, do much more than that. They act as ambassadors for their university and for their field of study, often taking on influential roles in their institution and helping guide, debate, and even public policy on the things that really matter to our very lives. They're also thought leaders in their institutions and often lead initiatives and chair important committees and other such things. Now, in this university, we are pleased to be able to boast over 50 colleagues now who have attained professorial title, and they're in fields such as diabetes and cardiovascular science, history, archaeology, marine science, Gaelic language and culture, and so on. We may only be a little over 10 years old, but we can already boast real excellence on the world academic stage for our research. And Roxane Andersen's addition to the professoriate adds a further dimension to that impressive and growing list. So, being awarded the title professor is a big deal and a very proud moment in the career of any academic. Roxane is already a real superstar, in my view, and in the view of many others, and that's borne out by the really large number of people who are here today in the audience. A new record for an event such as this, Roxane. You are an inspiring leader, communicator, researcher, and teacher. And it is with absolute pleasure that I'm now able to welcome you, Professor Roxane Andersen, Professor of Peatland Science, to the professoriate of the University of the Highlands and Islands. Very many congratulations to you.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Now, I know that everybody else is around is applauding and you can't hear it, but I can assure you they are. Now, that does bring us to the end of what's been a truly exceptional event today. But before everybody departs, if I could ask you just to take note of the thanks that we owe to our colleagues behind the scenes who have got everything ready for today's event, a really good event. And could I also advise you, as is coming up on the screen now, both that this lecture has been recorded and will be available on the university's YouTube channel in the next week or so, and that we have another professorial inaugural lecture next week, next Tuesday on the 8th of June at 4 p.m. They'll be delivered by Professor John Howell from the Scottish Association for Marine Sciences, SAMS, UHI, and it's titled Getting into Deep Water, Adventures in Marine Geology. Please do feel free to sign up to that and to join us if you can, and to any of the other events that are listed at the events page at www.uhi.ac.uk/events. Thank you everyone very much indeed, and a particular thanks to you, Roxane. It's been truly wonderful, and we wish you many, many more years of digging around in the peatlands to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.